Good evening. I'm Richard Reiser. I run a consultancy called World of Inclusion. I specialise in including disabled children, a wide breadth of disabled children and young people into the education system, both here and around the world. And why I say around the world is I was involved representing the British disability movement in New York in making the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. They use different language over there. They're wrong, but that's how they think about it. We are not persons with disabilities, we are disabled people, proud to be a group fighting the oppression that is disability. We have impairments, many different impairments: autism, ADHD, dyslexia, dyspraxia, I'm post-polio, spinal injury. It doesn't matter. We are disabled people because attitudes in society are what make us second-class citizens. And it's those attitudes that need to change, and attitudes turn into buildings as architects untrained in how to make buildings accessible for everyone build buildings like this one, which is not at all accessible, even though it's quite a modern one. And there are many worse than that. So the convention was a breakthrough, and it came really from 20 years, 25 years before that. Before that, we were represented as disabled people by people who treated us. People in white coats, generally, called Rehabilitation International. They were trying to make us normal. And in 1980, 400 disabled people walked and wheeled out of that convention and undertook to set up their own self-organisation, Disabled People International, and they had as their slogan, "Nothing about us without us." So that's our history. They then had to actually convince the UN that there was widespread discrimination against disabled people throughout the world, and my erstwhile colleague Rachel Hurst set up an international way of dealing with that. They gathered 2.6 million examples of discrimination, which convinced the diplomats in New York that there was a case, and that obviously the general UN Convention on Human Rights was being not applied to us. We were seen as subhuman, as a category that didn't have rights. And so that became the 11th Human Rights Treaty the world had signed up to. Incidentally, I want to flag up that all of those treaties are threatened by Trump because of his antipathy to the UN and all it stands for. And that is something that we cannot have. And of course, Theresa May has pulled him up once or twice about his excess, but really, deep down, I think they are much closer than they are apart. So what's that got to do with us? Well, we have this convention, but the government doesn't do very much with it. It hardly, having signed it into recognition in 2009, the Labour government, the Tories didn't say no, we won't do it, or the coalition. They just haven't done it. They haven't implemented anything in it. It's not incorporated into British law. The Labour Manifesto says it will be, and yesterday we moved a reference back which was successful that said Article 24 will be fully implemented in Labour's education policy, and that is inclusive education. It's not a two-type of school, it's all schools moving towards including all children. And that will mean in the end, and it will take, I think, 10 to 15 years, we will see the phasing out of segregated education. Now, before you all panic, that doesn't mean they'll be replaced with schools as they are now. The whole point of this is to develop schools that are truly inclusive schools. And that means we need a truly inclusive curriculum. It means we have to get rid of the national curriculum, we have to get rid of assessment, we have to get rid of, certainly have to get rid of academies, all schools under state control, and teachers need training. And they'll probably need more training, they'll probably need 4 years training to deal with all of the things that they have to do. It's going to be a properly trained workforce, with support staff having progression and recognition of their expertise and the massive expertise they do at the moment. At the moment, the SEND system is creaking, and it's held up by people really who paid very little and are doing an enormous amount of work, the school teaching assistants and support workers. And the government took away their national negotiating structure, which had a structure of pay progression, and that will be brought back by a Labour government, and it will be brought back with a proper progression. And I would like to see a lot of those teaching assistants being able to go forward and train as teachers as well and have that opportunity, because their experience is crucial. However, there are many schools which we're going to have a real problem with, because we are so far down the Tory track of privatisation, and petty tyrants who've been supported by these methods to become the principals. Often they don't call themselves head teachers. CEO is another phrase you'll find now in schools, the CEO of the MAT, paying themselves £400,000 and are not teachers at all. So all of that will have to be broken down, but there are many examples of good practice despite all the barriers where schools are still managing to include people, less so than before. If you want to see some current examples, if you go to the World of Inclusion website, it's my website, I made a film just 6 months ago in Eastleigh Secondary School in Newham, where there were a number of children on the spectrum, plus a number with learning difficulties, plus a whole range. Is it too loud? Too loud?
It's got a strident voice.
Okay, I'll speak with it like this. Is that all right?
Yeah, that's
okay. Sorry. Yes, so we need to do that, and so the schools in Newham are still doing it, although that too is being challenged by certain head teachers who want to set up more and more mats in that area. Newham was the first area back 35 years ago that said we don't need special schools, which will provide support for all children in mainstream, and the people who work in the special schools will become support teachers and support staff and go around peripatetically. That worked until local management of schools was brought in. Of course, that challenged having a centralised support team, and they have less support than they did, and therefore things are going down. But for many years, for at least 20 years, Newham became the highest achieving area. It was fourth most poor area at the time in the 80s and 90s, and yet it became above the national average for the whole cohort all the time, because the children were educated together in properly inclusive methods. So we know it works. It can work where the support is given, and we know it's worked in many places around the globe. Now, how can we move forward as we are now to actually prepare for this? Well, we can keep advocating for this manifesto. We can train people. We need to make people use what's available. Now, we have a huge crisis in our schools in England on SEND funding. That has been entirely created by the government. It didn't need to happen. £10 billion are available out of a budget of £43 billion in English schools for SEND. That's 22%. So we shouldn't be having a crisis. But because of the narrowing of the curriculum and the throwing out of large numbers of children, many more not being made welcome, so a few years ago the government woke up to one of these things, the high levels of bullying, particularly amongst SEND students, much higher than any other group within the school, higher than LGBT students actually, which you wouldn't think. You think, well, that's surely a group that would get picked on, but no. It is the SEND kids who are getting picked on a great deal, and schools are meant to have a mandatory anti-bullying policy, and under the law they're meant to have zero bullying. Now, who inspects that? Ofsted? Forget it. They won't even look at those statistics, even though they have a statutory duty to do so. They're only interested in results, and that's a real problem. Yet they say they're interested in safeguarding. Very strange. So we have to actually look at that. The Equality Act says every publicly funded body, that includes all the schools, but it also includes civil service departments everywhere, has a duty to promote disability equality. Promote it, not just have it, but to promote it. We see little sign of that anywhere at the moment, of actually promotion. We can do something about that. We can challenge by judicial review. We could get the unions to take more judicial reviews. We could get the Labour Party to take some judicial reviews of public bodies that are not actually implementing the public sector duty to promote disability equality. We should be supporting in our wards and our branches families and members to actually enforce the Equality Act. It was a Labour Act, it was the last thing that we passed, and then the Tories said they wouldn't implement quite a bit of it, but a lot of it is there. There is a duty of reasonable adjustment for all people who identify as disabled. And being on the spectrum means that you are under the definition of disability, which is to have a long-term impairment lasting for 6 to 12 months, which would count most people in, which means that you are at a substantial, which means in law more than minor and trivial, so it's a very low bar to get us, a substantial impact on your ability to do day-to-day things. Long-term, substantial, and that you have an impairment. That's pretty low. And so 13 million people is not the whole number that we have out of our population of 65 million. It's probably nearer to 20 million. So that's 1/3 of the population, we think, probably at least. And each person has a duty of reasonable adjustment. Now, because of the mess up of SEND funding and more and more pressure put on the budget, the higher needs budget, which is about 6 billion, parents are voting with their feet and going to tribunal and making individual solutions, and they are seeking specialist provision, some of which is good, all of which charges a great deal of money, but it's very dubious about how much good is actually done there. One thing we know for certain is that children get separated from their peers and they don't grow up in a peer group, and that's really problematic. So we need to turn that round. We will need to bring, as an incoming Labour government, all of those things back into the mainstream system. So we would have the capacity in every school to be able to deal with the diversity that there is out there. The other thing is, I think we need to have an inspection regime of equality rights. The thing about the Equality Act, and it applies to race, gender, sexual orientation as well, but I'm talking about disability, is it is entirely dependent on the individual who is discriminated against to fight it. Now, can you imagine that with Health and Safety at Work Act? No, we have an inspection system that goes around, gives a prohibition notice, and after 90 days, if they're not in order, place is shut down. Should be the same on equality. If a workplace, if a school, a college doesn't comply, funding withdrawn, finished. We need to have a much tougher regime, and part of the inspection teams of that should be disabled people themselves, who would actually be able to judge that. The last thing I wanted to say is that the transition that is required, the Labour Party says it's committed to the social model of disability. What does that actually mean? Well, it means a huge change in the way that people think. The way that we administer money, the way that we give support, the way that PIP and Disability Living Allowance and now the Universal Credit is given, although there's not much extra there for disabled people anymore in the way it's being rolled out, is on a medical model. What can't you do? And actually, if you want to get the benefit, you have to show that you can't do anything practically. So I always advise people, well, fill in the form for your worst day. Right? That's the only way you'll get any of these benefits. And yet there are millions of people who are entitled to it who don't get it. So far from there being too many claimants, millions of people who are entitled to the support because it was the extra cost when it was brought in 1987 by, believe it or not, Mrs. Thatcher, the extra cost of being a disabled person, which at the moment is about £570 on average a month, for the extra things that disabled people need, support and so on. Now, the last point then is, how do we go from seeing the problem in the person, the individual model of disability, to seeing the problem in the whole way that we structure our society? And you can see, of course, if we have to restructure on that level, we'll also be restructuring for a kinder, more compassionate, empathetic society, which will bring in many of the other things that we in Labour are supporting. Okay, thanks very much.
Thank you very much.